I'm John Batchelor, Malcolm Hoenlein Conference of Presidents, and we're immediately to Geneva, Switzerland. And we welcome the Executive Director of UN Watch, Hillel Neuer, to speak of several matters to do with international diplomacy, especially when it comes to contrariness. Hillel, a very good evening to you. And the question here immediately is something that sounds menacing. It's called a blacklist, and the blacklist involves both Israel and the United States out of international diplomacy. What is it, and what does it intend? Good evening to you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'll tell you about this blacklist, which just was released officially last week here in Geneva. That is a so-called database that the United Nations Human Rights Council mandated about 3 or 4 years ago to be created on companies doing business with Israeli communities situated over the Green Line. That would be if someone sells a light bulb to a family living in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, which is the site of the holiest places in Judaism, the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, and the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. If you live there, according to the United Nations, you're an occupied Palestinian territory. And they came up with a new thing a few years ago that you can't do business with anyone who lives there. That supposed rule exists nowhere in the world, where there are hundreds of conflicts and hundreds of disputed territories. Nowhere has anyone ever said that a company can't do business with someone who's in a disputed territory. But they made up that rule to target Israel. And over 3 or 4 years, America and Israel tried to persuade the international community and the UN not to publish this blacklist, but they did. It came out in February online, but it was presented here in Geneva at the infamous Human Rights Council last week. It lists over 100 companies, about 112 companies. Most of them are Israeli companies. They are the core Israeli companies, the leading supermarket chain, Rami Levy, the leading banks of Israel, Bank Leumi, the water company, Mikorot, the telephone company, which is Bezek. So all the major companies of Israel, which all have some aspect that goes over the 1949 armistice lines. And they said, you're on this blacklist. And although it doesn't say the words boycott, divest, and sanction, the infamous BDS, that's clearly the outcome and intent. And the moment that this blacklist was published, needless to say, anti-Israeli militants and activists around the world began chomping at the bit, saying that no fund manager or no endowment at a university could possibly invest in any of Israel's major companies or utilities because they're on this UN blacklist. It also names American companies like General Mills, Motorola, Airbnb. They're also blacklisted. Once again, if a company does business in disputed territories in Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara or Russian-occupied Crimea or in Tibet or anywhere else in the world, there is no issue. And in fact, the European Union is involved in companies that do business in those places. But here, a special case was made, and it's very clearly meant to target Israelis. And I'll just conclude that those who were pushing for this include genocidal regimes like Iran and Syria and North Korea, but also a New Yorker who's the head of a supposed human rights group named Ken Roth. He was one of the leading lobbyists for this blacklist, siding with Iran and North Korea and Syria. Ken Roth almost every day was pushing for this blacklist, and he was pressuring the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. And I have to say that the UN bureaucrats were, waiting on publishing it. It was mandated several years ago. They waited, but under pressure, they released it. So that's where we are. It was published last week.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Speaking about pressure, we turn to the International Criminal Court, where we may get a decision this weekend. John and I have talked about this in recent weeks, trying to inform people. But Bensouda, the prosecutor, has gone into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and this investigation she launched. Number one, is this really consistent with the mandate? And in what ways does her decision, you think, deviate from the original purpose of the organization? And does it show, then, the political bias against Israel and against the United States on a regular basis?
Look, Malcolm, tomorrow we're going to mark 75 years since the adoption of the United Nations Charter, a great document of liberal internationalism adopted in the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities when the United States and other world powers, the victors over the Nazis, came together to swear never again and to create an organization for international peace and security. And in sync with that were the Nuremberg war tribunals, where they judged Nazi war criminals. And over time came this idea that the international community should put at a supreme level the notion that no country can commit war crimes and get away with it. And the idea was that genocidal regimes, criminal regimes that have, locked up their judges or subverted the judicial system would somehow be held to account. And that was the idea, the motivating force behind the creation of the International Criminal Court some 2 decades ago. And somehow over time, this sacred, noble principle has gotten completely hijacked, such that you have two democracies, imperfect, flawed, should be held to account, but are held to account. Americans have, there are many Americans who don't like their president. Well, they can, vote him out. They can denounce him. They have all the tools at their disposal, whether it's Congress, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the judiciary. The same in Israel applies. If you don't like Netanyahu, you have all kinds of institutions of power to hold not only the president or prime minister, but also the military. And in both countries, the militaries are investigated, not perfectly, and one can call on the military investigation system in each country to be made better. But the notion that the International Criminal Court, which was designed specifically to come into play when the governments fail to hold their commanders accountable. Now, neither the U.S. nor Israel signed the International Criminal Court. They didn't join it, but nevertheless, activists found ways, clever legal ways, to implicate them nevertheless by, for example, if the country where the U.S. is involved with, like Afghanistan, if that's a signatory, then to pull them in. So both the U.S. and Israel have been implicated, and as you indicated, we're awaiting a decision by the pretrial chamber whether indeed the court can say that Palestine is a state and has jurisdiction, because the Palestinians referred the matter to the court. They asked the International Criminal Court to investigate Israel for what they call war crimes, when Israel is faced with thousands of rockets against its cities, and Israel dares to defend itself, then no matter what Israel does, those are considered disproportional war crimes, and somehow the criminal court is supposed to get involved. Now, the reason it's absurd is because by any measure, the court does not have jurisdiction. The court does not have jurisdiction because Israel is a democracy that does hold its leaders to account. It has put presidents and prime ministers in prison. It made the defense minister back in 1982, Ariel Sharon, resign after he was accused of not doing enough to stop Christians from massacring Muslims in Lebanon, and there are other examples. So again, it's not perfect, but Israel is a system that has both democratic institutions and accountability, and yet the ICC is trying to arrogate to itself jurisdiction. The other notion is the sense that building settlements are war crimes, and again, that's a Jew building a house in the old city of Jerusalem, which is the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, the ancient capital of King David, and where the temples, first and second temples, stood. And here in Europe, where I speak to you, all across the museums of Europe are paintings with Jesus at the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers. But suddenly now at the United Nations, there never was a temple. It's only referred to in the Muslim terms, and the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. And if you dare to build a home there, you're committing a war crime. You're somehow like a Nazi.
Hillel.
So I think that the notions of war crimes have been completely hijacked.
Hillel Neuer is an international lawyer. He is executive director of the UN Watch based in Geneva, Switzerland. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents. I'm John Batchelor.